Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, we've been doing these programs during the lockdown to try to give people some sense, some comfort during a very difficult time. And we've been concentrating on the legal, the social, economic, and medical implications of COVID-19, which have confused us all, and understandably, and everybody's anxious about this. And we've been hoping that these programs will be some comfort, some guidance, and some education for those of you who've been listening. And today, I'm particularly delighted to welcome onto the program Professor Thuli Madonsela. It is a cliche to say, generally with someone like her, that there's no need for an introduction. In her case, that is certainly true. But a professor at the University of Stellenbosch, basically heading up a whole project with regard to social justice. And of course, as we know, the person who really put the Office of the Public Protector on the map in more ways than one. So Thuli, thank you very much for doing this. I know you pulled on all sorts of fronts. And I wanted to ask you, because social justice is your basically beat these days, and rightly so, what do you sense about the effects of COVID-19 on not just on social justice, but on poor people and on millions of South Africans who really are living at the margins and haven't had social justice?
Thank you, J.P. Davis. I appreciate this privilege. COVID-19 has been particularly harsh on the poor and those who are on the margins of society. For them, it's been a double blow. The illness itself, coronavirus, COVID-19, affects a whole lot of the poor because they tend to live in congested domestic setups. They are likely to find themselves walking into malls on their own, not being digitally connected and therefore not doing e-commerce. And they're likely to be attending funerals of relatives, as it is culturally so. So that's the health part of it. And of course, not many of them have legal aid. I'm sorry, not many of them have medical aid. And they to use public hospitals, and public hospitals in the Eastern Cape are appalling. And a whole lot of money went elsewhere before COVID-19. And now under COVID-19, we hear that it's gone to PPE. So that's the first part of how poor people have been affected. But the regulations themselves and the policy and regulatory framework has also had a disparate impact on the poor. Again, I spoke about, for example, migrating commerce, governance, and education into digital platforms. Those who are not on digital platforms have been excluded. Even those who can access digital platforms, they don't have the money, and many don't have the expertise. Many poor people or semi-poor people are in the gig economy. The regulations have hit them hard. And when you look at the intersection of race and gender, and the intersection of poverty and inequality, you will find that the majority of the people who have been hard hit are women living in townships and villages.
So you've put up a lot on the table, and I wonder if I can just drill down a little bit. Perhaps let me start actually with that last point about gender. There seems to be an astonishing amount of gender violence. There always is, but there seems to be even more than normally is the case. Or have I got it wrong?
No, say you haven't gotten it wrong. Gender-based violence has increased. I've never seen so many young girls killed. I've never seen so many young girls and young women kidnapped, trafficked, and killed, and ruthlessly so. I've never seen so many grandmothers killed, raped, and just generally brutalized. So it has increased. One would ask why, and people would say there isn't effective policing. That's true as well. One of our ambassadors from the Tuma Foundation, for example, was telling us about a case a few days ago where using an app that one of our ambassadors has designed, they told them, a friend told the police that her friend is missing. Here's where the app says she is. The police did nothing. And eventually she was found dead with the child. So policing is bad. But I also think we're putting too much of our eggs in the policing basket. Violence is not only because the justice system is not working. Violence is a symptom of a broken fabric of society. And I think that going back to our unjust past, we haven't done enough remembering, healing, and moving forward.
That seems to me that COVID-19 has now almost put a telescope on that, or a microscope on that, microscope's better, just kind of almost showing it in relief. I mean, as you describe these horrendous incidents, you know, one almost wants to shout out and say, this is not the kind of society I want to live in. It's too terrible. It's too horrible. And I suppose I know that, you know, and I've heard you speak passionately about the need to implement all sorts of social justice. Why is it that we have this extraordinary level of violence against women, and indeed violence against people? I mean, I was interviewing Raymond Sutner earlier today, and I spoke about the Colin Koza murder, and I wondered why it was that in America people were on the streets on George Floyd, which was terrific to see people of all races and gender and so forth on the streets protesting, we don't want this in our name, the killing of George Floyd. Why is it in South Africa that doesn't happen to the same extent?
I think there's been so much violence in our country in such a way that people are becoming indifferent, especially when it comes to violence against girl children and women. It's almost happening daily, and it doesn't shock us anymore. I think the George Floyd incident happened at the time when people had had enough of state actors under COVID-19. So it wasn't just that. I think the timing was perfect for society to unleash its fury, its anger. It's a state that doesn't function the way the state should function. And thank God it happened. When it comes to South Africa and gender-based violence, I honestly believe that we're experiencing a backlash. On the one hand, we're rebuilding our society, renewing South Africa. But I honestly think we haven't done enough of remembering the unjust past and its shadow on us. So here we are, addressing gender equality, putting our girls in education, pushing them through the judicial system to become judges, magistrates, to become owners of companies, CEOs, etc. But in a country where you're not just having a competition between men and women, but in a country where Black men themselves, especially from rural areas and townships, are also battling with the inequalities of the past. So when you advance girls, there's resentment. And that is coupled with, for me, stereotyping, gender stereotyping. The media is still telling us that boys, protectors and providers, whilst the reality is otherwise. Then you get a boy child or a young man, or a man generally, who's battling with their identity. And then they unleash it on successful women. Look at the people who are getting killed. Mostly beautiful, successful young girls, university ones, young ones, their own cars. You can really tell that it's the backlash. This is something that Susan Faludi spoke about when America opened up opportunities for Black people and for women at the same time. And Black women were doing very well. And women just generally were doing well, and fury was unleashed on them. And I think we're experiencing the same thing in South Africa, 26 years into democracy.
But we come from such a violent past. I mean, we come from a past in which violence was the name of the apartheid game. And I'm just worried how do we get out of this now? Are you suggesting, which I think there is some implication, that because we haven't dealt with the past properly, because we haven't addressed the unbelievable cleavages in our society between those who have, who are generally white, and those who don't, who are generally black, we are now, we can't fix the problem unless we actually look ourselves in the face, remember where we come from, and deal more holistically with the whole pathology of our country.
Absolutely, absolutely, Judge Davis. And when we look at our unjust past and its shadow, we shouldn't just look at the economic part of it. We should also look at the damage it did to our psyche. For example, resorting to violence to resolve problems, but also fury. We are an angry society.
Yes.
White people are angry at BEE, black people are angry. The expectations from the fruits of democracy are not being met. And men are angry at women for getting some of these fruits of democracy. And I think what we need is change management. Whenever there's disruption, human beings generally love their comfort zone. And when there is rapid change, or what you would call radical change, it makes people scared. And so coupling that with our violent past, people are angry, scared, and lashing out at those that they consider weak enough to be recipients of their violence.
But it is very worrying to me. I mean, you've highlighted it all. You said black people are angry, white people are angry. The whole country's angry. The whole idea after '94 was that we were going to come together as a nation, and perhaps bound by some conception of social justice, by some reparation of the past, some acknowledgement that some like me were privileged, some like you weren't, and many like you, because there were few of us and there were black people. And it seems to me we've just got stuck. And I'm just extremely worried. I mean, what hope, I mean, what's, people listening to this are going to say, particularly someone like yourself who's in iconic status in the country, what hope do you have for us?
We have a lot of hope, and we're doing healing. I do think that we skipped 2 steps when we reached democracy. We skipped remembering. Just remembering what happened, how it impacted people, and where are people right now. Trauma creates people who are traumatized, and traumatized people tend to be, they can be harmful to others. It's self-defense. So there is a lot of unhealed trauma, and you'll hear from my colleague Pumla, who did this matter, and Thuli Madonsela, and you'll hear from my colleague also, Wilhelm, who has worked in Israel and here, about how past traumas, both from the victim side and the descendants of the beneficiary group, you need tools and you need healing circles to deal with that. So we haven't done enough memory of what happened, and hence because nobody seems to understand, for example, why do we need advancing equality? We're equal. The Constitution says so. The law says so. Why can't we just be treated the same? There's no memory. There's no healing.
I read that often. Read that often. That actually, yeah. And I find that really extraordinary. By the way, thank you very much. You've given me a good idea to who to interview. I must interview Pumla, who I've been on platforms this before, but you're dead right, because she writes very perceptively about this issue. I wonder if I can then just ask you this, though. I mean, one of the things that shook me was one of your colleagues at Stellenbosch, who I did interview, Nick Spall, did a piece of research about hunger, poverty in South Africa, which was astounding, the level of hunger which is going on at present. And doesn't that reflect, I mean, there's some culpability here, for goodness sake. I mean, leave our history aside for the moment. I mean, how is it that we're allowing all these people to go hungry at night? I mean, Amartya Sen talks about the fact that you never have famine because of lack of food. You have famine because of lack of distribution of food. And that must be true in South Africa, is that millions of people going hungry every single night. that's not a recipe for a society which could be stable.
Absolutely. It's not a recipe for a stable society. It's actually a recipe for disaster, because hunger is a grave injustice. And if we look at what Adam Smith said about justice holding the fabric of society together, and when justice fails, that the fabric of society can be fragmented into atoms. This is what's happening. Hunger is a grave injustice. And you are saying this is an indictment. It's an indictment on all of us. You self-disclosed by saying you were advantaged in the past. Unmerited privileges plus merited advancement, because in the past it was like, monopoly, you're given an advantage to play, but at the end of the day, the best players will do well. But those who are excluded, they don't even have an opportunity to show whether they're good or not. And when they join later, you can't say, we're now equal. We've got to reset. And we failed to reset properly. We went for BE, which advantages mostly politicians and the black middle class. We went for employment equity, which advantaged people like me. I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't a affirmative action initially by yourselves at CALS, which got me into the door. And then what has happened since then, women getting me into the constitution drafting process, a law commission, women getting me into spaces, but that's affirmative action. So I too have a bearer of privilege. So the question is, those of us who are bearers of privilege, can't we reset and think about who are we leaving behind? Our policies are more like focused on a trickle-down approach. We're not looking at family by family, ward by ward, which is what in the M plan for social justice we're talking about. Almost using the theory you presented yourself at our inaugural social justice lecture, which we thank you for providing, looking at restitution, looking at recognition and representation. But that should apply at ward level. We're 4,392 wards. If you say leave no one behind, as we say in Sustainable Development Goals, then find and meet people where they are. These trickle-down policies are the reason why we've become one of the most unequal societies in the world, because people like me have benefited. But the Gogo Dlamini down there are shifting further behind.
I just want to say this, whatever you were a beneficiary of, I think you were partly a beneficiary of the fact that I like to think of myself as someone who spots talent pretty well. I remember a young researcher, didn't matter what we said, you had your own views about it, and that is what we thought was important. So, but be that as it may, and it gives me great pleasure to see where you've come to. But what I wanted to ask you about, that you are actually suggesting, it seems to me, that at this moment, at this inflection point, we should be sitting down and thinking about a reset of policy that doesn't leave anybody behind, that doesn't use the trickle-down approach, that says black economic empowerment and that sort of policy, which was terrific for the middle class, is not enough. We've got to do something much more holistically. Is that what didn't? I mean, if you were talking to him now, is that what you would tell him, that that's what he's got to do to lead the country in that direction?
Absolutely. That was the thinking behind the Equality Act. If it was a systems approach to looking at everywhere, all aspects of life, all groups that were impacted by the injustices of the past, and the ground-up approach, that was the Equality Act. And 20 years since the Act was passed, the advancing equality part of it, which is Chapter 5, remains unimplemented, purely because, again, these people were influenced by classical economists who told them, no, to go for your trickle-down approach. You can't have a trickle-down approach in any event where the advantage group was so tiny. You really do need a ground-up approach. And so that what I would say is, let's do that. Stellenbosch is doing that as a university. Firstly, we started with a restitution statement, which is memory. We remembered And I don't know there are many universities that have a statement that says, yes, the past was unjust. Yes, the shadow of the past is still with us, and we played a part in that ugly past. We now commit ourselves to healing the divisions of the past and advancing equality. I think government needs to come to the party with policies like that.
But don't you think there's one hope about that there seems to be, at least at this particular point in time, quite a lot of people who generally were old classical economists, or alternatively, if you wish, in the establishment. I mean, I read even in the Financial Times articles which are suggesting now that the whole idea of austerity, the whole idea of kind of the traditional economic policy can no longer succeed, given the enormity of what COVID-19 has done to us. So I suppose the real question is, if that is correct, how can we prevent ourselves from making the same mistakes again?
Well, the starting point is what I would say impact-conscious policy planning. At Stellenbosch University, we've come up with a tool similar to government's a tool that is called CS, Social and Economic Impact Assessment System. We've come up with one that is called Social Justice Impact Assessment Matrix. Whatever you do, think about how it's going to impact on two things. Will it reduce inequality for older people, rural people, township people, white people, Black people, nationals, unnationals, gender unassigned, LGBT? How will your policy impact, which is what we're failing when it comes to COVID-19, to make sure that at that level. And secondly, so that is one size fits all should be left behind. The damage we
carry on.
Yeah, the damage we do through one size fits all policies cannot be remedied by special programs policies like your Employment Equity Act, BEE Act. Everything that we do has to be impact conscious on two levels, equality and poverty. If we are going to end poverty by 2030 as per SDGs, we'll have to be conscious. But secondly, or at the level of the economy, people are right that if we continue with our notions of growth, our economic cake is not going to grow, and we're not going to be able to reduce poverty and inequality by 2030. In other words, we won't be able to get more work for everyone, more wealth for those, for everyone, and better well-being for everyone. We'll not be able to do that. We need to start thinking like Israel. I know people don't like Israel, and I don't want to get into those politics, but Israel as a startup nation started thinking differently about doing things. Look at where you are, who you are, and leverage the advantages you have to get through, to lift yourself up, and to claim your place in the marketplace.
That's true. And Germany did the same after the Second World War. But I'm running out of time, so I want to ask you one final question, if I can. Been extraordinarily, need to get you back again for another half an hour. But can I ask you this? I know you don't want to, and I don't want to get you compromised by talking about your successor, but I am interested in the following. Just the Office of the Public Protector, in the light, I mean, your experience, in the light of all of the corruption that is taking place in South Africa at present, it's not even alleged anymore. The president acknowledged this, and he made a heartfelt speech the other night where one could only feel for him in saying, what kind of society are we steal from poor people in the middle of COVID? Doesn't the Public Protector's Office have a role here? I mean, why do we need new institutions? Wasn't the design of the institution that you were ahead to deal with maladministration? I'm not asking about what they're doing. I don't know what the new Public Protector is doing, and I'm not interested in that. I'm just interested in principle.
No, certainly the Public Protector has a role in pushing back against maladministration. And you've hit the nail on its head about corruption and maladministration. If you look at the allegations on what has happened in COVID-19 PE procurement, you will see that even before we get to the possibility of corruption, there's maladministration issues here. Emergency procurement does not mean that you don't test the market, you don't show that you find out upfront who has been supplying those things on a day-to-day basis, and therefore they're verifiable. Pricing, you've got to check that. Overbilling, false billing, and overcharging, all of those issues are simple issues of maladministration that can be checked at the level of the head of procurement, the financial officer, or the chief financial officer, and the DDG. Even if you're not involved in corruption, these things should not happen just purely from an administrative point of view. And I think the Public Protector and the Auditor General are agencies that probably need to start engaging with government using the reports we wrote in the past and said, here are your fault lines. Have you fixed them? If you haven't fixed them, please fix them.
It always seems to me, and it comes back to the economics as well, it always seems to me that the way we work with things in the country, we've got a problem, then we've got to have something new, a new policy, a new institution, a new agency. Whereas actually, we've got enough policies, we have enough institutions, just get them to work properly, and then we'll solve the problem, it seemed to me, which is why I'm so, particularly you were in the privileged position of knowing what the Public Protector does better than anybody else. That's why I asked.
You're absolutely right. But the good thing about what has happened, though, is that there is some leveraging of existing institutions. For example, when it comes to what they have done to pull together the law enforcement agencies, yes. It's really important that sometimes you can have multiple, an overkill and an underkill, where there's many institutions, but there are cracks between them, and a whole lot of things fall through the cracks. And pulling this together and connecting the lines is a wonderful thing. Secondly, using existing institutions and saying the ministers should come together and do a systems analysis and look at where are the fault lines and close the tap even before investigations are done is extremely important, because the good thing about this alleged corruption, overbilling, overbilling and false billing is that it has happened in the early stages of COVID-19, and therefore we can close those taps fast. And ministers doing that is a good idea. When it comes to a government acting properly, for example, I was very happy when the Minister of Justice announced that as soon as all information is given to him on what has been procured and how much, that information will be put out there in the public. But lastly, Judge Davis, I do want a new institution, us, ordinary people. I am recommending to the government of South Africa something I recommended when Max Sisulu was still the Speaker of Parliament. Let's have America's bounty laws. Let's have your ordinary Gogo Dlamini out there be part of the solution when it comes to corruption, overbilling, false billing, and overcharging. And the bounty laws work this way. I spot out that something went wrong. I whistleblow to a law firm. The law firm verifies and investigates. If the prosecution prosecutes and gets a certain amount of money, the law firm, or I get 25% of it, and I'll pay the law firm whatever we've agreed to. If government refuses to prosecute and the law firm prosecutes on its own, it can get up to 40% of whatever is recovered. I think we really need to form a bulwark against the corrupt, the ineptitude, and the thieves.
Have you told that to the new speaker?
I haven't. I think I should actually speak to Sis Thandi. Very reasonable person, but
yes,
honestly,
very good person. Yes,
we need all hands on deck against corruption, maladministration, and ineptitude.
I'm with you. I'm afraid we ran out of time. That was a terrific way to end. Keep up the good work. It's wonderful to have seen you, and thank you so much for your time, for what has been a very conversation. Thanks.